Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The New Science of Giambattista Vico. We are on Book 2, Section 3, this entitled Poetic Morals, Chapter 1, and this is titled Poetic Morals and the Origins of the Vulgar Virtues Taught by Religion Through the Institution of Matrimony. And we begin with paragraph 502. The metaphysics of the philosophers, by means of the idea of God, fulfills its first task, that of clarifying the human mind, which needs logic so that with clear and distinct ideas it may form its conclusions and descend therewith to cleanse the heart of man with morality. Just so the metaphysics of the poet giants, who had warred against heaven in their atheism, conquered them by terror of Jove, whom they knew as the wielder of the thunderbolt. And it humbled not only their bodies, but their minds as well, by creating in them this frightful idea of Jove. The idea was of course not formed by reasoning, for they were not yet capable of that, but by the senses, which, however false in the matter, were true enough in form, which was the logic conformable to such natures as theirs. This idea, by making them God-fearing, was the source of their poetic morality. From this nature of human things arose the eternal property, that minds, to make good use of the knowledge of God, must humble themselves, just as on the other hand arrogance will lead them to atheism, for atheists become giants in spirit, ready to say with Horace, "Heaven itself we assail in our folly." 503. Such God-fearing giants Plato certainly recognizes as represented by the Polyphemus of Homer, and we find support in what Homer himself tells of this same giant in this passage, where he makes him say that an augur who had lived at one time among the Cyclopes had predicted the woes which he later suffered at the hands of Ulysses, for augurs certainly cannot live among atheists. Thus, poetic morality began with piety, which was ordained by Providence to found the nations, for among them all piety is proverbially held to be the mother of all the moral, economic, and civil virtues. Religion alone has the power to make us practice virtue, as philosophy is fit rather for discussing it. And piety sprang from religion, which, properly defined, is the fear of divinity. The heroic origin of the word religion was preserved among the Latins by those who derived it from religando, binding, with reference to those fetters with which Tydeus and Prometheus were bound on the mountain crags, to have their hearts and entrails devoured by the eagle, that is, by the frightful religion of the auspices of Jove. Hence came the eternal property among all nations, that piety is instilled in children by the fear of some divinity. 504. Moral virtue began, as it must, with effort. For the giants, confined under the mountains by the frightful religion of the thunderbolts, learned to restrain their bestial habit of wandering wild through the great forest of the earth, and acquired the contrary custom of remaining hidden and settled in their fields. Hence they later became the founders of the nations and the lords of the first commonwealths, as we have indicated above, and as we shall set forth more fully further on. This has been preserved by vulgar tradition as one of the great benefits conferred on the human race by heaven, when it regained on earth through the religion of the auspices. And hence came Jove's title of stayer or stablisher, as we have said above. And with this effort likewise the virtue of moderation began to show itself among them, restraining their bestial lust from finding its satisfaction in the sight of heaven, of which they had a mortal terror. So it came about that each of them would drag one woman into his cave, and would keep her there in perpetual company for the duration of their lives. Thus the act of human love was performed under cover, in hiding, that is to say, in shame. And they began to feel that sense of shame which Socrates described as the color of virtue. And this, after religion, is the second bond that keeps nations united, Even the shamelessness and impiety destroys them. 505. Such was the origin of marriage, which is a chaste carnal union consummated under the fear of some divinity. We made this the second principle of our science, with its source in our first principle, which is divine providence. It arose accompanied by three solemnities. 506. The first of these solemnities was the auspices of Jove, taken from the thunderbolts by which the giants were induced to observe them. From this sors, or lot, signified by the auspices, marriage was defined among the Romans as a lifelong sharing of lot, and the husband and wife were called lot sharers. And to this day, Italian girls, when they marry, are said to take up their lot, prender sorte. In this determinate way, and in this first time of the world, arose the law of nations, that wife follows the public religion of her husband. For husbands shared their first human ideas with their wives, beginning with the idea of a divinity of theirs, which compelled them to drag their women into the caves. And thus even this vulgar metaphysics began to know the human mind and God. And from this first point of all human things, Gentile man began to praise the gods, in the ancient Roman legal sense of citing or calling them by name. Whence the phrase, laudare auctores, bidding men to cite the gods as authors of whatever they themselves did. Such must have been the praises which men owed to the gods. 507. From this most ancient origin of marriage came the custom by which women enter the families and houses of the men they marry. This natural custom of the Gentile nations was preserved by the Romans, among whom women were regarded as daughters of their husbands and sisters of their children. Thus not merely must marriage have been from the beginning a union with one woman only, as it continued to be among the Romans, a custom Tacitus admires in the ancient Germans, who, like the Romans, kept intact the institutional origins of their nations, and who give us ground for conjecturing similar beginnings for all others. But it must also have been a union to last for life, as indeed remained the custom among the great many peoples. Hence, among the Romans, marriage was defined, with this property in view, as unbroken companionship of life, and divorce was introduced very late among them. 508. Proceeding from the auspices thus taken from the thunderbolts of Jove, fabulous Greek history describes Hercules, a poetic character of founders of nations, as we saw above and as we shall observe more closely, as born of Alcmena by a thunderbolt of Jove. Another hero of Greece is Bacchus, born of thunderstruck Semele. This was the first reason for which the heroes called themselves sons of Jove. The assertion was a truth of the senses for them, persuaded as they were that all things were the work of the gods, as we have reasoned above. And this is the meaning of that passage of Roman history, in which to the patricians who said in the heroic contests that the auspices were theirs, the plebs replied that the fathers of whom Romulus had composed the Senate, and from whom the patricians traced their descent, quote, were not descended from heaven, end quote. For if this does not mean that the fathers were not heroes, it is hard to see how the reply is appropriate. Hence, to signify that connubium, or the right to contract solemn nuptials, whose chief solemnity was the auspices of Jove, was the prerogative of the heroes they represented, noble love as winged and blindfolded in token of his modesty, and called him Eros, a name similar to heroes, hero, which was their own. And they created a winged Hymen too, the son of Urania, whose name is from Uranos, heaven, and signifies she who contemplates the heavens, to take thence the auspices. Urania must have been the first of the Muses, for she was defined by Homer, as we have noted above, as the science of good and evil, and she too, like the rest, was conceived as winged, because she belonged to the heroes as we have set forth above. We have also explained above the historic sense of the saying about her, a Iov principium Musei. She and the other Muses were held to be daughters of Jove, for religion gave birth to all the arts of humanity, of which Apollo, held to be principally the god of divination, is the presiding deity. And they sing in that sense of canere and cantare, which means foretell to the Latins. 509. The second solemnity is the requirement that women be veiled in token of the sense of shame that gave rise to the first marriages in the world. This custom has been preserved by all nations. Among the Latins, it is reflected in the very name nuptials, for nuptiae is from nubendo, which means to cover. And since the returned barbarian times, maidens have called virgins incopio, in covered hair, in distinction from married women who go about veiled. 510. The third solemnity, also preserved by the Romans, was a certain show of force in taking a wife, recalling the real violence with which the giants dragged the first wives into their caves. And by analogy with the first lands which the giants had occupied by taking physical possession of them, properly wedded wives were said to be manukaptai, taken by force. 511. Out of solemnized marriages, the theological poets fashioned another divine character, second to that of Jove, namely Juno, the second divinity of the so-called gentes maiores. She is both wife and sister of Jove, because the first lawful or solemn marriages, called lawful from the solemnity of the auspices of Jove, must have taken place between brothers and sisters. She is queen of kingdoms and men, because the kingdoms were afterwards born of these legitimate marriages, and she is fully clothed, as we observe in statues and medals, to signify modesty. 512. The heroic Venus, too, called Pronuba in her character of patron goddess of solemn marriage, covers her private parts with a girdle, which effeminate poets later embroidered with all the incentives to lust. But later, when the austere history of the auspices had become corrupt, Venus was believed to have lain with men, even as Jove with women, and to have conceived Aeneas by Anchises, for Aeneas was born under the auspices of this Venus. And to this Venus are attributed the swans, shared by her with Apollo, who sing in that sense of canere or cantare, which means divinari, to foretell. Taking the shape of one of these swans, Jove lies with Leda, signifying that under the auspices of Jove, Leda conceives the egg-born Castor, Pollux, and Helen. 513. Juno is called Jugulis of the yoke, with reference to the yoke of solemn matrimony, for which it was called conjugium, and the married pair conjugus. She is also known as Lucina, who brings the offspring into the light, not natural light, for that is shared by the offspring of slaves, but the civil light by reason of which the nobles are called illustrious. And she is jealous with a political jealousy, that from which the Romans down to the 309th year of Rome excluded the plebs from connubium or lawful marriage. By the Greeks, however, she was called Hera, whence the name the heroes gave themselves, for they were born of solemn nuptials, of which Juno was the goddess, and hence generated in noble love, which is the meaning of Eros, which was identical with Hymen. And the heroes must have been so called in the sense of lord of the families, in distinction from famuli, who, as we shall see, were in effect slaves. Heri have the same meaning in Latin, whence hereditas for inheritance, for which the native Latin word had been familia. With such an origin, hereditas must have meant a despotic sovereignty. And by the law of the 12 tables, there was reserved to the family fathers a sovereign power of testamentary disposition, in the article, quote, as the family father has disposed concerning his property and the guardianship of his estate, so let it be binding. End quote. The disposing was generally called legare, which is a prerogative of sovereigns. Thus the heir becomes a legate, legatee, who in inheriting represents the defunct paterfamilias, and the children no less than the slaves were included in the words rei sua and pecunia. all of which proves only too conclusively the monarchic power that the fathers had had over the families in the state of nature. This they were bound to retain, and we shall see later that they did in fact retain it, in the state of the heroic cities. These must in origin have been aristocratic commonwealths, that is, commonwealths of lords in origin, for the fathers still retained their power, even in the popular commonwealths. All these matters will later be discussed at length. 514. The goddess Juno imposes great labors on the Theban, that is, the Greek Hercules, for every ancient Gentile nation had a Hercules as its founder, as we have said above in the axioms. This signifies that piety and marriage form the school wherein are learned the first rudiments of all the great virtues. And Hercules, with the favor of Jove under whose auspices he was begotten, surmounts all the difficulties. He was therefore called Heracles, that is, Heras Kleos, the glory of Hera or Juno. And if glory be properly esteemed, as Cicero defines it, as widespread fame for meritorious acts on behalf of the human race, how great a glory must it have been for the Herculeses to have founded the nations by their labors. But when these severe significations had been obscured by time and customs had become effeminate, Juno's sterility was taken as natural, and she was held to be jealous only of an adulterous Jove. Hercules was then made a bastard son of Jove, who by Jove's favor, and in despite of Juno, had carried out all his labors. Thus he became not Juno's glory, but her complete disgrace, by an interpretation of his name quite contrary to the facts, and Juno was made a mortal enemy of virtue. Originally, the hieroglyph or fable of Juno hanging in the air with a rope around her neck and her hands tied by another rope, and with 2 heavy stones tied to her feet, had signified the sanctity of marriage. Juno was in the air to signify the auspices essential to solemn nuptials, and for the same reason Iris was made her handmaiden, and the peacock with its rainbow tail was assigned to her. She had a rope about her neck to recall the violence used by the giants on the first wives. Her hands were bound in tokens of the subjection of wives to their husbands, later represented among all nations by the more refined symbol of the wedding ring. The heavy stones tied to her feet denoted the stability of marriage, for which Virgil calls solemn matrimony conjugium stabile. But now this fable was taken as representing a cruel punishment inflicted by an adulterous Jove, and with the unworthy interpretations bestowed upon it by later times with corrupted customs, it has greatly exercised the mythologist ever since. 515. For these very reasons, Plato interpreted the Greek fables as manetho, and had the Egyptian hieroglyphs, observing on the one hand the incongruity of gods having such customs, and on the other the congruity of the fables with his own ideas. Into the fable of Jove he intruded the idea of his ether, which flows and penetrates everywhere, on the strength of the phrase, "All things are full of Jove," as we have said above. But the Jove of the theological poets dwelt no higher than the mountains, and the region of the air in which lightning is generated. Into the fable of Juno he intruded the idea of breathable air. But Juno has no offspring by Jove, whereas the ether and air produce everything. So far were the theological poets from understanding by this fable that truth of physics which teaches that the universe is filled with ether, or that truth of metaphysics which demonstrates the omnipresence attributed to God by the natural theologians. Above poetic heroism, Plato raised his own philosophic heroism, placing the hero above man as well as beast. For the beast is the slave of his passions, and man in the middle of the scale struggles with his passions, while the hero at will commands his passions. And thus the heroic nature is midway between the human and the divine. And Plato held that the noble love of the poets, called eros, from the same root as heros, hero, was fittingly imagined as winged and blindfolded, and plebeian love as without wings or blindfold, to set forth the 2 loves, divine and bestial, the one blind to the things of the senses, the other intent upon them, the one rising on wings to the contemplation of intelligible things, the other, for lack of wings, falling back upon sensible things. Ganymede, borne off to heaven by an eagle of Jove, and thus signifying to the austere poets the contemplator of Jove's auspices, became in corrupt times an ignoble pleasure of Jove. But Plato, by a fine conceit, took him to the metaphysical contemplative, who, through contemplation of supreme being, by the method he calls unitive, has achieved union with Jove. 516. In this way, piety and religion made the first men naturally, 1. Prudent, by taking counsel from the auspices of Jove; 2. Just both in that first justice towards Jove, who, as we have seen, gave his name to the just, and in that towards men, by not meddling in another's affairs, as Polyphemus tells Ulysses of the giants scattered among the caves of Sicily, which, though it appears to be justice, was in fact savagery. And moreover, 3. Temperate, content with one woman for their lifetime. And as we shall see later, piety and religion likewise made them 4. Strong, industrious, and magnanimous. Such were the virtues of the Golden Age, which was not, as effeminate poets later pictured it, an age in which pleasure was law. For in the Golden Age of the theological poets, men insensible to every refinement of wearisome reflection took pleasure only in what was lawful, and regarded as lawful only what was useful, as is still the case, we observe, with peasants. The heroic origin of the Latin verb iuvere is preserved in the expression iuvat, it helps, for it is pleasant. Nor were the philosophers right in imagining it as an age in which men read the eternal laws of justice in the bosom of Jove, for at first they read in the aspect of the sky the laws dictated to them by the thunderbolts. In conclusion, the virtues of that first time were such as we found admired by the Scythians, who would fix a knife in the ground and adore it as a god, and thus justify their killings. That is, they were virtues of the senses, with an admixture of religion and savage cruelty, whose affinity may still be observed among witches, as we noted in the axioms. 517. From this early morality of the superstitious and cruel Gentile world came the custom of sacrificing human victims to the gods. This we have from the most ancient Phoenicians, among whom, when some great calamity was imminent, such as war, famine, or pestilence, the kings sacrificed their own children to placate the wrath of heaven, as Philo of Byblus narrates. Such sacrifices of children were regularly offered to Saturn, according to Quintus Curtius. Justin says the custom was continued by the Carthaginians, a people undoubtedly of Phoenician origin, as we shall observe, and was practiced by them down to their latest times. This is confirmed by Ennius in the verse, quote, "And the Phoenicians, i.e. Carthaginians, were accustomed to sacrifice their own children." End quote. After their defeat at the hand of Agathocles, they sacrificed 200 children to placate their gods. The Greeks fell in with this impiously pious custom of the Phoenicians and Carthaginians in the votive sacrifice Agamemnon made of his daughters Iphigenia. This should cause no surprise to anyone who reflects upon the cyclopean paternal power of the first fathers of the Gentile world, a power exercised by the most learned nation, the Greeks, and by the wisest, the Romans. In both these nations, down to the times of their most cultivated humanity, fathers had the right to kill their newborn children. This consideration will certainly lessen the repugnance our modern mildness makes us feel for the action of Brutus in decapitating his 2 sons, who had plotted to restore the tyrant Tarquinius to the rule of Rome, and for that of Manlius, called Imperius, in cutting off the head of his brave son who had fought and won a battle against his father's orders. Caesar reports that the Gauls also offered sacrifices of human victims, and Tacitus in the Annals relates of the Britons that the divine science of the Druids, who, according to the conceit of the scholars, were rich in esoteric wisdom, divined the future from the entrails of human victims. This cruel and frightful religion was prohibited by Augustus to Romans living in Gaul, and it was forbidden to the Gauls themselves by Claudius, according to Suetonius in his life of that emperor. Students of Oriental languages thus hold that the Phoenicians had spread through the rest of the world the sacrifices of Moloch, identified with Saturn by Mornay, van der Drach, and Selden, to whom they offered a man burnt alive. Such was the humanity which the Phoenicians, who brought letters to Greece, went about inculcating in the first nations of the most barbarous Gentiles. It is said that Hercules had purged Latium of a like fearful custom, that of throwing living men into the Tiber as sacrifices, and that he had introduced instead the practice of throwing in men of straw. But Tacitus tells of solemn human sacrifices among the ancient Germans, who certainly throughout all remembered time were cut off from all foreign nations, so that the Romans with all their strength in the world could not penetrate among them. The Spaniards, too, found such rites in America, which until 2 centuries ago was hidden from all the rest of the world. The barbarians there feasted on human flesh, according to Lescarbot in History of New France, which must have been that of men who had been consecrated and killed by them. Such sacrifices are described by Oviedo, Historia de las Indias, so that while the ancient Germans were beholding the gods on earth, and the American Indians likewise, as we have noted of both above, and while the most ancient Scythians were rich in so many golden virtues, as we have heard them praised for by the writers, in these same times they were practicing such inhuman humanity. All these human sacrifices were those called in Plautus the host of Saturn, Saturn's victims, at a time that writers call the Golden Age of Latium. Such a mild, benign, sober, decent, and well-behaved time it was. 518. We may conclude from all this how empty has been the conceit of the learned concerning the innocence of the Golden Age observed in the first Gentile nations. In fact, it was a fanaticism of superstition which kept the first men of the Gentiles, savage, proud, and most cruel as they were, in some sort of restraint by main terror of a divinity they had imagined. Reflecting on this superstition, Plutarch poses the problem whether it was a lesser evil thus impiously to venerate the gods than not to believe in them at all. But he is not just in weighing this cruel superstition against atheism, for from the former arose the most enlightened nations, while no nation in the world was ever founded on atheism, as we have shown above in the Principles. 519. So much may be said of the divine morality of the first peoples of the lost human race. The heroic morality we shall discuss in its place. This is the end of Section 3 on Poetic Morals. In the next video, we will proceed to Section 4 on Poetic Economy. Thank you for listening.